The first time I realized my father had erased me, it wasn't during an argument. It wasn't even during a family dinner. It was when my key didn't fit the lock. The brass sign on the glass door still carried our name in polished letters. The family business. 3 generations. My grandfather's portrait hung in the lobby, stern and proud, as if he were still watching the reception desk. I had grown up beneath that portrait, tracing the carved frame with my fingers while waiting for my father to finish meetings. I knew the scent of that building better than the scent of my own home. Fresh coffee in the mornings, printer ink, leather chairs warmed by the afternoon sun. That morning, the receptionist avoided my eyes. My key turned halfway, then stopped. I tried again, slower this time, pressing my shoulder against the door as if it were a misunderstanding. It wasn't. The lock had been changed. Through the glass, I saw my younger cousin sitting at my old desk. My desk. The one I had earned after graduating top of my class in business management. The one my father had proudly shown clients, telling them his daughter would one day run the company. I had believed him. I had believed every applause at every graduation ceremony meant something. A security guard I didn't recognize approached me with careful politeness. He explained that my access had been revoked. He used the word revoked like I was a subscription, like I had expired. Inside, my father stood in the conference room. He didn't come out. He watched. That was the first fracture. By evening, the family group chat had gone silent. My mother sent a single message about how I should rest and reflect. My aunt posted photos of my cousin in a tailored suit, sitting at the head of the conference table. The caption called him the future. I had built half of those client accounts. But suddenly, I was described as unstable, emotional, unreliable. The rumor spread quietly, like smoke under a closed door. Clients were told I had mishandled financial records, that I had exaggerated achievements on proposals, that the university I attended was reviewing certain discrepancies related to a scholarship grant I had once received. The university is investigating the fraud. That phrase reached me through a former classmate who messaged in confusion. My name, apparently, was being whispered in administrative offices. Fraud. The word felt foreign in my mouth. I remembered the nights I stayed awake balancing ledgers, the weekends I sacrificed, the pride in my father's eyes when I secured our biggest contract. I remembered the way he used to introduce me as his smartest investment. Now I was a liability. At home, my husband moved quietly, unsure which version of me would walk into the kitchen each evening. The silent one or the furious one. My mother-in-law called to offer careful advice about humility and patience. She never directly accused me, but her pauses were heavy with doubt. Even our cleaner, Maria, looked at me differently, as though the air around me had shifted. I tried calling my father. He didn't answer. Late one night, I drove past the office building. The lights were still on. Through the window, I saw my cousin practicing a presentation I had designed. My slides, my projections, my research, substitution of achievements. He was speaking with confidence that wasn't his own. That was when I noticed something else. In the corner of the conference room sat a man I had only seen twice before in my life. Older, reserved. He never spoke at family gatherings. He never appeared in company brochures. The silent partner. He watched my cousin with an expression that wasn't approval. It was calculation. And for the first time since the lock refused my key, I felt something unfamiliar rising in my chest. Not despair. Anticipation. The email from the university arrived at exactly 7:42 a.m., as if it had been timed to catch me unprepared. I was standing barefoot in the kitchen, watching the kettle begin to tremble, when my phone lit up with the official crest of the institution that once celebrated me. For a moment, I simply stared at it, suspended between past and present. That university had been my sanctuary, the place where I proved, to myself more than to anyone else, that I was capable of building something independent of my father's shadow. Now it was questioning the very foundation of that identity. The subject line was sterile, neutral. It informed me that an internal review had been initiated regarding irregularities connected to a scholarship award I had received during my final year. It used words like verification and compliance. It did not use the word fraud. but everyone else already was. By noon, 2 former classmates had viewed my social media profile without liking anything. A professor who once praised my thesis removed her endorsement from my professional page. The silence was louder than accusation. My father moved quickly. An article appeared in a local business blog praising the company's strategic restructuring under my cousin's leadership. It briefly referenced a recent internal audit that had uncovered concerning inconsistencies in past operations, carefully implying that the errors had occurred during my management period. The substitution was almost elegant. He didn't attack me directly. He replaced me. My cousin now presented my contracts as his own negotiations. He signed my clients with a slightly altered signature. Even my office chair, custom leather, chosen by me after months of saving, had been moved closer to the window, as though to let more light fall on its new occupant. At home, tension settled into the walls. My husband tried to be steady. He reminded me of evidence, of timelines, of documents. He insisted that truth had weight. But even he checked the mailbox more carefully than usual, as if expecting something official and unforgiving to arrive. My mother called in the evening. Her voice carried the gentle exhaustion of someone who had already chosen a side, but wanted to pretend she hadn't. She suggested that perhaps I had misunderstood certain financial processes, that maybe ambition had clouded my judgment, that my cousin was simply more grounded. Grounded. The word pressed into my ribs like a dull blade. I drove to the university 2 days later. The campus looked unchanged. Students hurried between buildings, balancing books and coffee cups, unaware that one of their former success stories was being quietly disassembled. I passed the hall where I had once stood on a stage, receiving an academic award while my father clapped louder than anyone. Inside the administrative building, I was escorted to a small conference room. The blinds were half closed, filtering the daylight into thin, judgmental lines across the table. The committee members avoided prolonged eye contact. They explained that an anonymous submission had raised concerns about discrepancies in documentation tied to my scholarship funding. The room felt suddenly smaller. I provided copies of emails, bank transfers, official confirmations. Every document aligned perfectly, every signature authentic. But the damage wasn't in the paperwork. It was in the suspicion. As I left the building, I noticed a familiar car parked across the street. Dark windows. Idling engine. It belonged to the company fleet. He was watching. My father didn't confront me directly. He observed. That night, I received a message from an unknown number. It contained a single sentence. Some doors close so others can open. No name. But I recognized the phrasing. The silent partner. I had only spoken to him once years ago, during a Christmas dinner where he sat at the end of the table, quietly studying everyone. His name was Daniel Harrow. He owned 30% of the company, quietly, invisibly. My grandfather had brought him in decades ago, trusting his discretion. Daniel never interfered. Until now. The next morning, an envelope arrived at my house. No return address. Inside were photocopies of internal company emails. Emails I had never seen. Emails dated weeks before my lockout. They discussed restructuring optics, controlling narrative, and preemptive reputation management. One line stood out. If her academic credibility is questioned, client confidence will shift naturally. My hands trembled. Not from fear, but from clarity. This wasn't about business. It was about erasure. My father wasn't just removing me from the company. He was rewriting the story of my competence. If the university declared my scholarship invalid, every contract I negotiated would appear fraudulent by association. Every achievement would be reframed as deception. Substitution of achievements. Not just within the company, but within my life. I looked again at the anonymous message. Some doors close so others can open. It wasn't comfort. It was warning. That evening, I drove past the office once more. The conference room lights were on again. My cousin was presenting. My father was nodding. And in the corner, Daniel Harrow sat with his hands folded, watching. Not my cousin. Watching my father. There was something in his stillness that felt less like agreement and more like preparation. For the first time, I understood something crucial. The investigation at the university wasn't the beginning of my downfall. It was the beginning of someone else's exposure. The university's second letter arrived on a Monday, thinner than the first but heavier in consequence. It informed me that the review was expanding, not because they had found evidence against me, but because additional materials had been submitted anonymously. The tone had shifted. There was no longer polite neutrality. There was caution. Someone was insisting. Someone was pushing. I sat at the dining table long after reading it, tracing the wood grain with my fingertip the way I used to trace the carved frame of my grandfather's portrait in the office lobby. Patterns had always comforted me. They made chaos feel intentional. But this chaos was designed. Across town, my cousin had just closed one of my largest client renewals. I knew because the client's assistant sent me a confused message, asking why I hadn't attended the meeting. When I didn't respond immediately, she followed up with congratulations on my career pivot. Career pivot. The substitution was complete. I was being rewritten as a footnote in my own work. By midweek, whispers began to circulate in professional circles. A former colleague sent me a screenshot from an industry forum. My name appeared in a thread titled, "When Credentials Collapse." No evidence. No details. Just suggestion. My husband tried to anchor me. He suggested public clarification, a statement, legal action. But something in me resisted reacting too quickly. I remembered the envelope, the photocopied emails, the phrase about optics. This was choreography. And somewhere in the choreography stood Daniel Harrow. The silent partner hadn't contacted me again, but his presence lingered like a shadow just outside my line of sight. I began researching him. He rarely appeared in public records beyond his initial investment decades ago. No interviews. No photographs beyond a single, grainy company gala from 15 years ago. He was a man who preferred leverage to attention. On Thursday evening, as rain slid down the windows in slow, distorted lines, another envelope arrived. Inside were financial summaries. But these weren't mine. They were company reports, internal performance comparisons between my management period and my cousin's first month in control. The contrast was subtle but devastating. Revenue projections had been inflated under my cousin's leadership. Client retention rates were artificially framed as new acquisitions. There were handwritten notes in the margins. Daniel's handwriting, I assumed. Precise. Analytical. One note read, "False confidence collapses under audit." Another, "He is overplaying the hand." The realization struck slowly. The investigation at the university was not meant to destroy me. It was bait. If my father could publicly discredit me, he could justify consolidating control of the company under my cousin. With my reputation fractured, no one would question the narrative shift. The silent partner's 30% would become symbolic, not strategic, unless he intervened. That night, I drove again to the office building. The rain had stopped, leaving the pavement reflective and dark like polished obsidian. Through the second-floor windows, I saw them gathered around the conference table. My father stood at the head. My cousin gestured confidently at a screen filled with graphs I recognized as my own framework, altered slightly, rebranded subtly. Even the font choices felt like theft. And Daniel sat as always in the corner. But this time he wasn't still. He was speaking. No one else moved. My father's posture shifted, not dramatically but enough. His shoulders tightened. My cousin's hand hovered awkwardly mid-gesture, frozen in uncertainty. The meeting ended earlier than usual. As employees filtered out, I noticed something else. Two unfamiliar men entering the building with leather briefcases. Their expressions were neutral, professional. Auditors. The next morning, industry news sites published a brief but pointed update. Family-owned firm undergoing internal review amid leadership transition. It wasn't about me. It was about them. The timing was surgical. The university emailed me again, requesting a final meeting. Their tone had changed once more. Less accusatory, more curious. They had received new documentation contradicting the anonymous claims. They were tracing the origin of the submission. Tracing. For the first time since the lock refused my key, I felt the balance shifting. At home, even my mother-in-law softened. She forwarded me a message circulating among extended relatives. It questioned whether the narrative about my alleged misconduct had been exaggerated. The family tone, once confident in my guilt, had become uncertain. My father called that evening. He didn't apologize. He didn't explain. He simply asked whether I had been in contact with Daniel. His voice carried something I had never heard before when speaking to me: concern. After the call ended, I stood in the hallway staring at my reflection in the mirror. For weeks, I had looked like someone unraveling. But now, beneath the exhaustion, there was clarity. I wasn't the only one being investigated. The university's audit was procedural. The company's audit was existential. And Daniel Harrow, the silent partner who had watched from the corner of the conference room for years, had finally stepped out of stillness. But not for me. For something larger. As I lay awake that night, another thought surfaced, slow and unsettling. What if I had misunderstood his intentions? What if I wasn't being defended, but positioned? The auditors arrived before sunrise. I knew because one of the junior accountants, one of mine, sent a single message at 6:12 a.m. The office doors had been unlocked early. Boxes of archived files were being pulled from storage. External drives were being cataloged. My cousin's confident stride had been replaced with rigid pacing. The building that once felt like an extension of my bloodstream now pulsed with quiet panic. I didn't go there. Instead, I waited. By noon, the university called. The committee's tone was no longer cautious. It was formal, almost apologetic. The anonymous submission had originated from an IP address traced back to a private corporate network. The metadata embedded in the forwarded documents revealed alterations. Dates had been modified. Financial figures had been subtly edited before submission. The documents weren't proof of my fraud. They were proof of fabrication. The university would be issuing a statement clearing my academic record. They would not mention names, but they would confirm that the allegations were malicious and unfounded. Malicious. The word tasted sharp, but vindicating. I thanked them with steadiness I didn't feel. When the call ended, I stood still in the center of my living room, absorbing the silence. Weeks of whispered doubt collapsed in a single exhale. But relief was interrupted by something heavier. If the documents had been altered inside the company network, then someone within the business had orchestrated it. And I already knew who had the most to gain. By late afternoon, the industry blog that once praised our strategic restructuring published another update. It was cautious this time. It referenced discrepancies discovered during an internal audit. It hinted at misrepresentation of performance metrics under the new leadership. The substitution was unraveling. I drove past the office again that evening. The conference room lights were brighter than usual. Through the glass, I saw my father seated, not standing. His posture was different, less commanding, more defensive. My cousin avoided eye contact with the auditors. And Daniel Harrow stood at the head of the table, not seated in the corner, standing. The sight felt almost unreal. For years he had been peripheral, an architectural detail in the background of our family's power structure. Now he occupied the center. I didn't need to hear the words to understand the shift. The next morning, I received a message from Daniel's assistant requesting a private meeting. The location was not the office. It was an older building downtown, a quiet investment firm Daniel owned separately. The lobby smelled faintly of polished wood and old paper. No family portraits. No legacy photographs. Just neutral walls and muted light. He was already waiting when I entered. Daniel Harrow looked exactly as I remembered. Reserved, composed, eyes that missed nothing. He didn't waste time on pleasantries. He laid a thin folder on the table between us. Inside were transaction records. Not scholarship documents. Company accounts. Hidden transfers dating back 2 years. Funds rerouted through secondary vendors. Inflated contracts signed under my father's authorization. Performance bonuses issued before revenue milestones were met. My removal from the company had not been about competence. It had been about timing. The audit Daniel initiated was not triggered by the university investigation. It preceded it. He had discovered irregularities months earlier. He had quietly monitored them. When my father accelerated the leadership transition to my cousin, Daniel understood the strategy. Discredit me publicly to justify consolidating authority before the internal discrepancies surfaced. The university accusation was a shield, a distraction. If I were seen as fraudulent, any financial inconsistencies during my tenure could be attributed to me. The narrative would be simple, clean. I would be the scapegoat. The lock on the door hadn't been punishment. It had been insulation. Daniel's voice remained steady as he explained what he had done. He had allowed the transition to occur. He had allowed the university allegation to unfold just far enough to collect proof of orchestration. Every email, every modified document, every internal instruction about optics had been preserved. He hadn't stepped forward to protect me. He had stepped back to let the trap complete itself. For the first time, I understood the stillness I had mistaken for indifference. He wasn't passive. He was patient. But then he said something that shifted everything again. The company's bylaws contained a clause written decades ago by my grandfather. In the event of financial misconduct by a managing partner, controlling authority could temporarily transfer to the silent partner until an independent review concluded. Daniel now held that authority. My father's access had been restricted that morning, the same way mine had been weeks ago. I felt no triumph, only a strange, hollow symmetry. As I left the meeting, the air outside felt colder than it had in weeks. My phone buzzed repeatedly, family messages layered with confusion and panic. My aunt demanded clarification. My mother asked if I had known about the audit. My cousin remained silent. And my father called. This time I didn't answer, because a new realization was settling into place. Daniel hadn't just revealed corruption. He had positioned me, not as a victim returning to reclaim her desk, but as the only executive whose record had now been formally cleared, both academically and financially. The scapegoat narrative had collapsed, but so had the structure I once fought to re-enter. As night fell, I stood outside the office building once more. The lights were dimmer now. Employees exited quietly, avoiding one another's eyes. And inside, through the glass, I saw Daniel alone at the conference table, waiting. The headlines were restrained. They did not scream scandal. They did not use explosive language. They spoke instead of temporary leadership restructuring and financial clarification measures. The phrasing was deliberate, almost merciful. But inside the building that once carried my family name like a crown, mercy had evaporated. Employees moved carefully now, as though the floors themselves might crack under the weight of shifting authority. My cousin stopped posting polished photographs. His tailored suits were replaced with wrinkled shirts and tired eyes. My aunt's proud social media captions disappeared overnight. And my father did something I had never seen him do. He went silent. The silence wasn't dignified. It wasn't strategic. It was stunned. Daniel's temporary control had triggered an independent review that extended beyond internal metrics. External auditors combed through vendor contracts, tracing inflated invoices and redirected payments. The irregularities were precise enough to suggest intention, but subtle enough to evade immediate detection. My father had not stolen recklessly. He had adjusted carefully, and he had expected loyalty to shield him. Instead, loyalty fractured under scrutiny. At home, the air felt charged. My husband moved through rooms with quiet caution, watching me as if I might shatter or ignite at any moment. My mother-in-law called less frequently now. Her tone had shifted from skepticism to concern, though she never directly apologized for her earlier doubts. The university released its formal statement clearing my academic record. It circulated faster than the original rumor. Screenshots of the announcement appeared in professional forums. Former classmates began sending awkward messages of support. But vindication carried no sweetness, because Daniel had made his offer. He invited me back to the office under his authority, not as an employee reclaiming a desk, but as interim managing director during the investigation. The clause in the bylaws gave him the power to appoint leadership until the review concluded. He chose me, not out of sentiment, out of optics. A daughter previously accused and publicly cleared returning to stabilize the company created a compelling narrative. It signaled integrity restored. It reassured clients. It quieted speculation. Substitution of achievements had been reversed. Now my competence was not erased, it was necessary. When I stepped into the building again, my new access card worked smoothly. The click of the lock felt almost theatrical. Employees watched me with a mixture of relief and discomfort. Some avoided eye contact, unsure whether they had believed the rumors too easily. My old desk had been restored to its original position, but something inside me had shifted. The portrait of my grandfather still hung in the lobby, but it no longer felt like a blessing. It felt like a question. In the conference room, Daniel stood as I entered. No ceremony. No applause. Just a transfer of authority documented in writing. My signature joined his on an interim leadership agreement. My father was not present. He had been advised to step back during the investigation. Later that evening, he requested a private meeting. We met not at the office, but at the family home where I had grown up. The house felt smaller than I remembered. The walls carried the faint scent of furniture polish and old memories. He looked older. Not fragile, but diminished. He spoke in careful, measured sentences about misunderstanding and pressure. He referenced market volatility and difficult decisions. He implied that he had only been protecting the business from instability, protecting it from me. There was no apology, only justification. For the first time in my life, I saw clearly that my father's greatest fear was not losing money. It was losing control. The lock on the office door had not been a rejection of my ability. It had been a warning. I had grown strong enough to challenge him. And challenge was unacceptable. As I left the house, I understood something Daniel had not explicitly said. This was not a rescue. It was a recalibration. The company could survive the audit. The financial discrepancies, while serious, were structured in ways that allowed restitution rather than collapse. With careful handling, reputational damage could be contained. But the family would not recover. My cousin avoided me entirely. My aunt's messages carried defensive undertones. My mother oscillated between guilt and loyalty. The fracture was no longer professional. It was permanent. That night, alone in the conference room after everyone had left, I reviewed the numbers again. The company was salvageable. Clients were stabilizing. Staff morale, though shaken, could be rebuilt. I had the authority now. Temporary, but real. Daniel entered quietly, standing by the window where I once watched my cousin practice my presentations. He observed the city lights for a long moment before speaking. The investigation would conclude in weeks. My father would likely be forced into formal retirement. My cousin's role would be reduced permanently. The board would need to elect a permanent managing director. Daniel's vote would decide it. He didn't promise it to me. He simply let the implication rest between us. Authority, once tasted, alters the tongue. As I sat there in the dim glow of the city, I realized the final decision would not be about reclaiming what was mine. It would be about redefining what mine meant, and whether I was willing to sever the last thread tying business to blood. The final audit report arrived on a gray morning that felt almost indifferent to history. No sandev. No dramatic collapse. Just a thick envelope placed neatly on the conference table, where generations of my family had made decisions they believed were permanent. Daniel sat across from me, composed as always. The independent auditors joined remotely, their voices precise, clinical. The findings were structured in careful language. Unauthorized reallocations of funds, manipulated performance forecasts, premature bonus disbursements. Not catastrophic theft. Not corporate ruin, but deliberate distortion. The report concluded with a recommendation. Formal censure of my father, financial restitution to the company, and immediate restructuring of executive control. The board vote followed within hours. For decades, those seats had been symbolic. Family allies, loyal friends, people who nodded at my father's vision without examining its foundation. Now they were cautious. Fear alters loyalty faster than gratitude ever does. Daniel abstained from speaking until the final moment. When he did, his words were simple. Stability required credibility. Credibility required transparency. And transparency required leadership unburdened by unresolved conflict. The vote was nearly unanimous. My father was removed from operational authority permanently. My cousin's role was reduced to a non-executive position with oversight, and I was offered the role of managing director. Permanent. The room was quiet after the decision, not celebratory. There was no applause this time. No proud father clapping from the front row. Just responsibility. I signed the documents with a steady hand. The lock that once rejected my key had been replaced. This time, the access was mine by choice, not inheritance. News of the restructuring spread quickly. Industry blogs reframed the narrative. What had begun as whispered suspicion against me ended as a story of internal reform. Clients expressed cautious optimism. Employees, some of whom had doubted me, now watched for direction. But inside the family, silence hardened. My father did not attend the formal announcement. He sent no message. My mother's voice trembled when she called that evening, unsure whether to congratulate or mourn. The house I grew up in would be sold, I later learned. Pride is expensive when reputation fractures. And yet, I felt no triumph. Because the greatest twist had not been the audit. It had been Daniel. A week after the vote, he requested one final meeting. This time, the conference room felt different. Not tense. Not strategic. Simply transitional. He explained what he had never revealed before. My grandfather had once approached him not merely as an investor, but as a safeguard, a quiet counterweight. The silent partner clause had been written specifically to prevent legacy from becoming tyranny. My grandfather had feared that bloodline loyalty could one day blind the company to reason. Daniel had not stepped in sooner because he believed generational tension could resolve naturally. But when he saw my father begin consolidating authority through distortion, when he saw the university allegations submitted through corporate channels, he recognized the moment the clause was designed for. He hadn't positioned me to save the company. He had positioned the company to survive my father. And then he said something I hadn't expected. His 30% stake would be transferred. Not sold. Transferred. To a trust structure that removed concentrated control from any single family member, including me. The era of one dominant voice was over. If I remained managing director, I would do so under a governance model that required accountability from all sides. I felt the weight of that decision more heavily than the board vote itself. Power without oversight had nearly destroyed us. Power with balance might preserve us. When Daniel left the building that afternoon, he did not linger. The silent partner returned to silence, but this time by design, not distance. Days later, I stood alone in the lobby beneath my grandfather's portrait. For years, I had interpreted that painting as expectation, then as pressure, then as accusation. Now I saw it differently. Legacy is not ownership. It is stewardship. I drove to my parents' house one final time before it went on the market. The rooms echoed with emptiness. My father stood by the window where he used to rehearse speeches for company events. He looked smaller in the wide frame of the room. He did not apologize. But he did something else. He acknowledged that I had been stronger than he anticipated. For him, that was concession. For me, it was closure. As I left, I understood that the lock on the office door had been necessary, not to exile me, but to reveal the structure beneath the surface. Substitution of achievements had tried to rewrite my story. The investigation had tried to fracture my credibility. But silence, when used wisely, can be more powerful than accusation. The business still carried our family name, but its future no longer depended on family approval. On my first official morning as managing director, I arrived early. I unlocked the door myself. The click echoed softly through the quiet lobby. Employees filtered in gradually. The air carried the familiar scent of coffee and printer ink. Only now it felt earned, not inherited. And for the first time, I understood that being locked out had not been the end of my place in the story. It had been the beginning of my authority to rewrite it.